The US finally moves to extradite Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou. China decides its courts are too independent. And kidnapping? The Chinese Communist Party wouldn't dream of it. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for the latest China news and click the notification bell so you get an alert when we publish a new episode. Well, we all knew it was coming, and it finally happened.
The US has told Canada to expect a formal request to extradite Meng Wanzhou, the detained CFO of Huawei.
But that doesn't mean it's going to happen right away, or even at all. Because if there's one thing the US government loves, it's endless paperwork. Back in December, Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of China's largest telecom company, Huawei. It was at the request of the US. Huawei has been accused of using a shell company to violate US sanctions on Iran and possibly Syria. Needless to say, after weeks calling for Meng's release, the Chinese Communist Party was not too happy with the idea of extradition to the US.
On Tuesday, Beijing shot back, saying Canada should release Meng immediately and accusing the two countries of abusing their extradition treaty.
Canada and the United States arbitrarily abused their bilateral extradition treaty to seriously infringe upon a Chinese citizen's security and legal rights. We urge the Canadian side to immediately release Ms. Meng Wanzhou and earnestly safeguard her legitimate and lawful rights and interests.
Yeah. She's entitled to legitimate and lawful rights. In Canada, obviously, not in China. No one has rights in China, especially not Canadians. That's why the Chinese regime had no qualms about detaining two Canadians and accusing them of spying based off what I'm sure is very solid evidence. Their real mistake, of course, was setting foot in mainland China in the first place. On Monday, 143 Western academics and diplomats sent this open letter to Chinese leader Xi Jingping, urging him to release the Canadians. And now, I can name 143 more people who should probably not set foot in mainland China. Speaking of ensuring legitimate and lawful rights, China's Supreme People's Court. They've ruled that the whole Western model of judicial independence is bad. They said China's courts should resolutely resist the influence of the West's erroneous thought and mistaken viewpoints. Mistaken viewpoints like, don't detain innocent people for political reasons. The Chinese Communist Party controls the courts, but that's not enough. It's also looking for more ways to exert direct control over religions. And what better way than rewriting the Bible to be more in line with correct thinking from the party? I talked about this in a recent episode, and as a joke, I read completely made-up quotes from this completely made-up book. At least, that's what I thought at the time. But now I've learned, and this is true, that local officials in Henan province ordered a Henan church to wipe out the first commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." I guess Christians didn't get the hint when they were told to replace pictures of Jesus with pictures of Xi Jinping. Speaking of brainwashing, more brainwashing. Since the time of former Chinese leader Hu Jintao, the one that we all forgot about, Chinese students have been forced to take current affairs and policies classes. Well, China's Ministry of Education has been pushing these classes even more recently. The goal is to help college students understand the situation at home and abroad in the new era correctly. Peking University, the Harvard of China, has taken the lead. They've opened an entire institute dedicated to what's officially called Xi Jinping Thought on Socialism with Chinese Characteristics for a New Era. I get it. You need an entire institute to figure out what any of those words mean. Fortunately, one Chinese student has dissected it. He told Radio Free Asia that the course is actually brainwashing education in combination with current events. He cited the US-China trade war as an example. The course tells how the United States is rude and unreasonable toward China. It also preaches that the party is very great and instills ideas about the party-state system and about xenophobia. Well, obviously the party is very great. Only the very great need to forcibly remind you that they're very great. And the party is obviously very great at disappearing people. For instance, Chinese-Australian writer Yang Heng Jun, who mysteriously vanished after getting off a plane in China last week. Days later, Chinese authorities finally admitted they had detained Yang, who was a blogger, novelist, and former Chinese diplomat. They said it was because Yang was endangering national security. It seems like Yang has become part of the Chinese regime's hottest new trend: hostage diplomacy. Of course, the Communist Party kidnapping citizens of other countries is not something new. It's just been more noticeable lately. So noticeable that people tried to convince Yang not to go back to China. But he told his friend Dr. Feng Chongyi that he would be okay because he had toned down his criticism of the party. Unfortunately for Yang, the Chinese Communist Party can really hold a grudge. Maybe Yang should have listened to Dr. Feng, especially since Feng was detained in China back in 2017. Make that 144 people who should not set foot in mainland China. The Chinese-controlled city of Macau. It's #1 in the world when it comes to gambling, and definitely when it comes to ugly architecture. So it makes sense that Macau's crime syndicates would also be #1. Well, police say they've uncovered a $4.4 billion money laundering scheme. So that's the ancient Chinese secret. Money laundering is a big problem for the Chinese Communist Party. China's elite, including party members, are concerned that China's economy isn't doing so hot. They want to get their money out, and while there are a bunch of laws in place to stop them, rich people always find a way. And that way is Macau, or it was until authorities found that a crime syndicate was smuggling in machines to allow gamblers to secretly cash out their casino winnings in Hong Kong dollars and Macanese patakas. This could be the beginning of a more serious investigation into Macau's money laundering, and why anyone would want Macanese patakas. And across the bay from Macau is Hong Kong, the other special administrative region of China. Hong Kong, of course, has its own government and laws, separate from the rest of China. Now, I know you're worried that this is a problem, because sometimes Hong Kongers' thinking is too independent and not in line with the correct thinking for a new era. But don't worry, that's starting to be rectified. The Hong Kong legislature is moving to make disrespecting the Chinese national anthem a crime. For far too long, Hong Kongers have been openly negative about the Chinese Communist Party. For example, by booing the Chinese national anthem at sports matches. The new bill proposes 3 years in jail for dissing China's national anthem, as well as a fine of over $6,000 US, or 51,000 Macanese patakas if you're trying to get rid of those. And yes, the proposed law also extends to school children, including pupils of international schools, who would be legally required to learn the anthem. Something fun to look forward to if you're planning on studying in Hong Kong. And before we go, now is the time when I answer questions from you, my loyal 50-cent army, fans of the show who support China Uncensored through the crowdfunding website Patreon. James Wahlberg asks, I know a lot of people are upset with Patreon and PayPal. Are you planning on finding other methods of payments for those who want to support China Uncensored but no longer wish to use their services? Great question. I know many of you are concerned about using Patreon as a platform after they kicked off several prominent YouTubers. I, of course, don't approve of that kind of behavior, so I can definitely appreciate where you're coming from. However, the problem is China Uncensored is already being squeezed by YouTube, and Patreon is still the best way for us to raise funds for the show. I started to look into Patreon alternatives like Subscribestar, but guess what? It doesn't always go well for alternatives. And even though Subscribestar is starting to resume payments, it's too big of a risk for us. We are working on creating our own alternative, but to do that, we still need funding. And right now, Patreon is the best option for us. You can visit our website to make a direct PayPal contribution, but we don't have a good way of making sure you get rewards, like me answering your questions on this show. So we prefer Patreon. I know many of you have expressed you're not a fan of Patreon, but for now, I'd ask you to hold out just a bit longer for the sake of China Uncensored. If you ditch Patreon, it doesn't hurt Patreon much, but it does hurt China Uncensored a lot. So thank you for your question, and thanks for your support. And thanks to everyone watching. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Chappell. See you next time.